Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so that you know when live we go.
Hello everybody, we are approximately 3 months away from prelims examination. It's high time that you buckle up and you know your standing at all India level. Considering this, Rao's IAS has launched Pre-Parikshan, under which we are going to have our first open mock test for GS Paper 1 from 19th to 21st March. For the top 50 performers in the Pre-Parikshan open mock test, there would be 100% scholarship for PTS and QIP 2021. For the next 100 performers, there would be 50% scholarship in PTS and our QIP course. When you attempt the open mock test under the Pre-Parikshan, you will be given your All India ranking. You'll also get the question level analysis to identify your strong and weak areas. You'll also have a comparative analysis to know the top score, average score, and your score. After the test, you will get live online test discussion. The registration link for the test is given in the description section. For those of you who already have account on our eLearn platform, you need not register again. You just have to log in into your account and you will find the test pinned at the top of your feed once the test is uploaded. You can attempt the test anytime between 19th to 21st March. Make the timeline of your preparation such that you feel comfortable to attempt the test covering all the sections of GS. Give the test confidently, get the feedback, and then accordingly for the next 3 months, re-strategize. It is important that you know your standing to have an appropriate strategy for the coming prelims, and for that you must give the test. Hello and welcome to the DNS session. We are going to take up discussion on today's newspaper, The Hindu, Delhi edition, 16th March 2021. We shall pick up articles important for civil service examination and discuss them as per the demand of the exam. The articles that we have chosen for today's discussion are there on your screen. The time stamping is there in the description section. Let's begin, or let's Nagendra sir begin.
Page number 8 of today's newspaper highlights a very important piece of information for avoiding human-elephant conflict. Now, bee fences to ward off elephant attacks. Now, this is a pilot project which is basically launched in Kodagu in South Karnataka to mitigate human-elephant conflict. Now, if we look into this particular issue, this topic is more important from the perspective of mains examination, and it will come under General Studies Paper 3. As a topic, it will come under environment, and as a subtopic, it will come under conservation. Now, whenever we talk about elephant, we are focusing on wild Asian elephants when we are talking about elephants in India. There are two types of elephants. One is, of course, wild Asian elephant, and other is the African elephant. Now, when we talk about wild Asian elephant, they are found in 13 countries of Asia. Now, the largest number of wild Asian elephants are found in India. Their population is in excess of 29,000 in India, and this is a data from 2017. Now, as far as the conservation status of elephant is concerned, the Asian elephant has been listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List since 1986. So this is an important piece of information which may be asked in the prelims examination as well. Now, since we are talking about human-elephant conflict, so we need to understand what are the primary causes for human-elephant conflict. First and foremost, we are aware of the fact that there has been an unprecedented loss of natural habitat. Now, elephants are normally found in dense forest, and we are aware of the fact that the percentage of dense forest has come down in India. And because of this particular fact, the natural habitat of elephant is now threatened. This actually leads to more human and elephant conflict as they are looking for food. Now, as there is a loss of natural habitat, elephants, in order to look for food and water, basically get into conflict with humans. And that is why we need to pay attention to the second important aspect, that is availability of food and water bodies is a follow-up challenge which elephants are facing, and this is leading to more and more human-elephant conflict, or HEC. The third important aspect is the fragmentation. Now, we are aware of the fact that when we talk about elephants, elephants migrate in a very big region. Now, we can actually imagine this thing as a situation in which this is a big forest area and elephants from this particular region move to the other region and go to the place B. Now the point is, because of human intervention or anthropogenetic reasons, what happens, this particular region is disconnected. Now the forest area is fragmented, and now when elephants transform from one particular area to another area, they basically get into human elephant conflict, and this has caused multiple problems in the recent past. Now on an annual basis, around 500 humans lose their life because of human elephant conflict. At the same time, this number is lesser in terms of human casualty. The casualty factor for elephants is much higher, and that is why this particular issue should be dealt in detail in order to understand how we can actually limit human elephant conflict. Now, whenever we are talking about human elephant conflict, we actually need to manage it in multiple ways. First and foremost, we need to focus on how we can actually manage the habitat where the elephant is currently living. Now, in this context, the first important aspect we need to pay attention to is the availability of food and water in the region where the elephant is living. For that particular purpose, we need to actually develop and maintain perennial water bodies. Now, we are aware of the fact that elephants are pachyderm animals and they basically require water on a very regular basis. And availability of water is one of the reasons for human elephant conflicts. So first and foremost, we need to actually do desilting, digging of water bodies, and we have to ensure that water is available throughout the year in these water bodies. So first and foremost, whatever water bodies are available in the habitat of the elephant, we need to manage them well. The second important aspect is the availability of food, and for that particular purpose, we need to focus upon creation of fodder plantation. Now, when we talk about the fodder plantation, we should be actually following a very scientific approach towards this entire thing. First and foremost, we need to understand that canopies should grow at a very fast pace as elephants eat a lot. And for that particular purpose, we need to do it in multiple ways. Now, whenever we use fire in order to spur the growth, we need to pay attention to multiple aspects. Now, some of the aspects which are important in this particular case is that we should start using modern firefighting equipments like blowers, beaters, etc. And this will ensure that we reduce human elephant conflict. Apart from that, we can also use drones, we can use local fire watchers, which will ensure that elephants are safeguarded in their habitat region. Now, we use these methods, and these methods are actually done so that the food availability is sufficient. Now, another significant aspect of ensuring availability of the food is actually grassland management, and for this particular purpose we need to get into vial management, wattle management, weed management, and management of invasive species. Now, whenever we talk about vials, they are basically micro habitats forming an ecological niche and marshy meadows which are surrounded by forest, and these are actually very important. We also need to pay attention to the weed management aspect, because weed basically eats up the area which elephant may use for their consumption, and hence we need to control invasive weeds like lantana, eupatorium, micania, and mimosa, etc. So these are very important from the perspective of weed management. We also need to pay attention to prospis and wattle weeds, which needs to be removed from the wildlife habitat, and rigorous monitoring and ecological restoration should be done to prevent re-invasion. Now, these practices are being implemented in the states of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, among other states, and these have emerged as one of the strong methods to actually avoid human-elephant conflict. The second important aspect after habitat management is actually to restrict the elephants in their natural habitats. Now, for this particular purpose, we basically need to set boundaries so that elephants do not venture in areas beyond. And for that particular purpose, we can go for elephant-proof trenches, which are deep trenches which elephant cannot cross. We can go for hanging fence, we can go for rubble wall, we can go for solar-powered fence. Beehive fence, as discussed in the article, is also being practiced here. Apart from that, we can also focus on rail fence. Now, rail fence has been an important issue. You must be aware of the fact that many times elephants lose their life because they come on railway track. This happens very regularly in Rajaji National Park. So this is something that we need to pay attention to. Apart from that, we can also go for biofence or chili fence. So there are some food items which elephants do not like. They basically are repelled by that, and we can use biofence or chili fence just to ensure that elephants do not cross the area which is earmarked for them. The third important aspect of this entire process after habitat management, restriction of elephant, is habitat improvement. Now we are aware of the fact that one of the primary reasons for elephants to get into conflict with humans is because they could not find enough food and water, and for that particular purpose we can improve their habitat by ensuring that they have sufficient food. And for this particular purpose we can go for bamboo planting or restocking so that elephants do not have to move outside. Apart from that, we can also do intensive soil working, which will ensure that enough food is available for elephants and they do not have to venture in other areas. Now, after improving the habitat, we also need to actually monitor the movement of elephants. Now, elephant is a massive animal, and for this particular purpose, we can utilize radio collaring them. We can also use drone, and we can also implement watchtower monitoring. So this particular set of methods will ensure that whenever elephants take fresh path or track, we are aware of in which direction they are heading, and we can make any kind of adjustment so that human elephant conflict is avoided. Now, the last aspect for which we need to pay attention to is strengthening of elephant corridor. Now, we are aware of the fact we have talked about fragmentation. Now, when we talk about the fragmentation, we want to highlight that the forest areas where elephants basically venture have been broken by invasion from anthropes, that is humans. Now in that sense we need to actually make adjustment or changes. For that particular purpose we may have to make changes in terms of relocation of villages so that this human elephant conflict is avoided. Apart from that, we also need to ensure that those paths which are taken by elephants for generation are safe and they can be easily monitored. In that sense, we need to ensure one thing, that we have to secure elephant corridors. Now this particular process has been done very successfully in Kerala. There is this area of Trinoli Kudrakote elephant corridor, and if you can look into this particular area, you can see that there is Theopati range and there is Beagle range. Now this area that you see in the dotted lines is basically the area in which elephant corridor is being secured. So these type of measures are required in order to ensure that elephants survive, and we need them not only to survive but to flourish so that the ecological balance is maintained.
This particular article appears on page number 14. This article is titled as India Post in talks for the global speed post delivery via DHL. Presently, the Department of Post earns the revenue basically through two sources. One, by providing banking related services through the India Post Payment Bank, and secondly, by providing various kind of postal services. Now, this particular article basically highlights that in order to boost its revenue that it earns through postal services, India Post is in talks with a global firm. As far as your UPSC prelims examination is concerned, you should have a basic idea about the India Post Payment Bank as well as the differences between two types of differentiated banks in India. That is, the difference between the payment banks and the small finance banks. This is quite important because as you can see in UPSC prelims 2016 as well as UPSC prelims 2017, we had questions related to the payment bank as well as the small finance bank. So going forward, we can expect a question related to the India Post Payment Bank. So let us focus on these two aspects of this particular article. See, whenever the Reserve Bank of India issues a banking license, it can issue a license either to a universal bank or to a differentiated bank. A universal bank can operate throughout India and it can provide all the banking related products. On the other hand, as the name suggests, the differentiated banks operate only in certain selected parts of India and they cannot offer all the banking related products. The idea behind the differentiated banks was first mooted by the Nachiket More Committee on the Financial Inclusion. Now, based upon the recommendations of the Nachiket More Committee, the Reserve Bank of India has introduced two types of differentiated banks, that is, the payment banks, and the small finance banks. So let us look at the differences between the payment banks and the small finance banks. As you can see, both these two categories of banks, they are registered under the Companies Act but licensed under the Banking Regulation Act 1949. The payment banks can accept only the demand deposits. They cannot accept either the fixed deposits or the NRI deposits. And moreover, they can accept deposits only up to rupees 1 lakhs, and on such deposits, the deposit insurance is available. As far as the small finance banks is concerned, they can accept both demand deposits as well as the fixed deposits. There are no quantitative restrictions on the quantum of deposits which can be kept with the small finance banks, and deposit insurance is also available on such deposits. The payment banks cannot lend loans. However, the small finance banks can lend loans. However, in order to ensure that the small finance banks predominantly lend loans to the poor and vulnerable sections of the Indian society, the RBI has mandated that at least 50% of the loans given by the small finance banks should be of a value less than rupees 25 lakhs. The payment banks can issue only the debit card and they are not allowed to issue the credit card. Now this is quite obvious since the payment banks cannot lend loans. The small finance banks can issue both debit card as well as the credit card. As highlighted before, both these two categories of banks have been set up by the RBI based upon the recommendations of the Nachiket More Committee. Once the RBI decided to set up these two categories of banks, RBI then set up two committees in order to evaluate the applications for these two categories of banks. It was a Nachiket More Committee which was set up in order to evaluate the applications for the payment banks. So the Nachiket More Committee went through the applications and then recommended to the RBI as to which entity should be given a license to operate as a payment bank. Similar to the Nachiket More Committee for the payment bank, for the small finance bank, it was the Usha Thorat Committee to evaluate their applications. The RBI's macroprudential norms such as statutory liquidity ratio and the cash reserve ratio, they are applicable to both these categories of banks. As far as the payment banks is concerned, as you can see here, they are not allowed to give the loans. So what they are required to do here is whatever deposits they get, at least 75% of their deposit, they would have to keep it in the form of the statutory liquidity ratio, that is predominantly in the form of the government securities. The remaining 65% of the deposits, they can maintain it in the form of deposits with other commercial banks. Both these two categories of banks are required to follow the Basel norms, wherein their capital adequacy ratio is 15% of the risk-weighted assets. The small finance banks are required to give at least 75% of the loans towards the sectors which have been categorized as a priority sectors. Some of the examples of the payment banks in India include Airtel, India Post Payment Bank, Paytm, Fino, etc. Some of the examples of the small finance banks include Ujjivan, Utkarsh, Jana, etc. Payment bank can be opened by any prepaid instrument provider, resident individuals, NBFCs, telecom companies, supermarket chains, etc. The small finance banks can be opened by resident individuals, private companies, societies, NBFCs, microfinance institutions, local area banks, and so on. And as we can see, in both these two categories of banks, FDI up to 74% is allowed, which is similar to the FDI that is allowed in the private sector banks. Please do let us know in the comment section as to what is the present FDI limit in the public sector banks in India. Now coming to the India Post Payment Bank. India Post Payment Bank has been set up as a payment bank under the Department of Post, Ministry of Communication. The Government of India is the sole owner of the India Post Payment Bank. Initially, it was given a license to operate as a payment bank and then it started commencing its operations in the year 2017, and recently in the year 2019, the Reserve Bank of India has decided to include the India Post Payment Bank in the list of the scheduled banks in India. Being a scheduled bank, the India Post Payment Bank can directly avail loans from the RBI. Please do note that not all the payment banks in India have been put under the list of the scheduled banks. For example, presently, Paytm is not listed as a scheduled bank under the RBI Act 1934. Now, this becomes quite important for your prelims examination. So, since India Post Payment Bank has fulfilled the criteria for a scheduled bank, it has been accordingly placed under the second schedule of the RBI Act. There are a number of benefits associated with issuance of banking license to the India Post Payment Bank. First and foremost, as you must be aware, the India Post has built up a vast network of the post offices, particularly in the remote and rural areas, and hence we can leverage these post offices in order to promote financial inclusion. More importantly, the bank accounts of the people in the India Post Payment Bank can also be used by the government in order to provide for the direct benefits transfer, leading to a much better transparency as well as reduction in the corruption. One of the most unique aspects of the India Post Payment Bank is that it has completely done away with the issuance of the ATM or the debit card. Instead of issuing the ATM or debit card, the IPPB has started issuing the quick response card. See, whenever you have to do a transaction through a ATM or a debit card, you would need an account number as well as PIN in order to complete the transaction. However, when you have to use a QR card issued by India Post Payment Bank, there is no need to remember your account number or the PIN. As you can see in this particular picture here, this QR card has a QR code. Now, this QR code contains all your necessary details such as name, bank account number, Aadhaar ID, and so on. So, if you have to carry out a transaction, you can simply scan this QR code. Upon scanning the QR code, you will be required to authenticate yourself through the OTP as well as biometric authentication. This biometric authentication through the thumbprint is in turn linked to the Aadhaar database. So by authenticating oneself, you can either deposit or withdraw the money in the bank account. Now, for example, as you can see in this particular picture, the postman here, he can either carry a smartphone or a micro ATM machine. So whenever a person requires to do the transaction, he or she must simply scan the QR code and then authenticate oneself through the OTP as well as through the biometric authentication. And once this authentication process is completed, you can either deposit or withdraw the money through the postman. So as you can see here the bank is coming to your doorsteps rather than you going to a bank or a ATM machine. There are a number of benefits associated with the quick response card. First and foremost, it enables the doorstep banking. Secondly, it is safe and secure. For example, let's say you have lost your ATM or debit card, and if someone else knows your PIN, he can use that particular PIN to withdraw the money from your bank account. However, the same cannot happen when you lose your QR card. And third benefit here is there is no need for you to remember either the account number or the PIN. Now, these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. The next article appears on page number 10. The article is titled as India's arm imports down by 33%. This article shall be important both from the perspective of GS paper 2, that is international relations, as well as GS paper 3, that is the internal security. This particular article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of a recent publication of a report by Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. This particular report basically analyzes the general trends in the global arms transfer. Normally, the global arms transfer on a yearly basis keep on fluctuating. Hence, this particular report measures the trends in the global arms transfer for a 5-year period. By looking at the trends in the global arms transfer, we can basically understand their impact on overall peace, stability, and security of the global environment. In its latest report, it has come out with the trends in the global arms transfer for a period 2016 to 2020. And as you can see here, the overall global arms transfer for this particular period is same as the global arms transfer for a period between 2011 to 2015. The major global arms exporters are, first and foremost, it is US, which accounts for almost around 37% of the global arms export. It is followed by Russia, France, Germany, and China. As far as the global arms importers are concerned, the topmost importer of the global arms happens to be Saudi Arabia with a share of 11% of the global arms imports. It is closely followed by India at second place, where India accounts for 9.5% of the global import of the arms. It is followed by Egypt, Australia, and China. As far as India is concerned, India's share in the global arms imports for a period 2011 to 2015, this was almost around 14%. However, as you can see, for the period between 2016 to 2020, India's share has got reduced to 9.5%. So in the last 5 years, India's share in the global arms import has got reduced. But even now, India happens to be the second largest importer of the global arms. The major exporter of the defense goods to India are Russia, followed by France, and at third place we have Israel. According to this particular report, one of the main reasons as to why the overall import of the global arms into India has got reduced is on account of the government's push for the indigenization of the defense industry. That is, the government is giving a thrust on Atmanirbhar Bharat in the defense manufacturing. To a certain extent, this has paid off, because of which India's share in the import of global arms has got reduced. So as far as your UPSC prelims examination is concerned, some important points which you should note from this particular article here is, first and foremost, you should know that the International Peace Research Institute is a global think tank that provides us with a report on the global arms transfer. You should make a note of the top 5 arms exporters and the top 5 arms importer. And you should also look at the general trends in the import of the global arms into India. This is as far as the prelims exam is concerned. As far as the mains examination is concerned, you should be aware about various steps taken by the government in order to ensure self-reliance and defense manufacturing, particularly with respect to the defense offset policy and the defense procurement procedure 2020. You should also understand as to what are the constraints and challenges in boosting the defense manufacturing and how these constraints and challenges can be addressed. Now, all of these aspects related to the Atmanirbhar Bharat in defense manufacturing have already been covered by me in the DNS dated 22nd of Jan 2021. So you can go through this particular DNS in order to know all the aspects related to the defense manufacturing in India. The link to this particular article has been provided in the description box below. The next article appears on page number 10. The article is titled as Supreme Court Bats for the Great Indian Bustard. This article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of Environment and Biodiversity. This article is also important because a rated question related to India's Desert National Park has already been asked in UPSC Prelims 2020. In the early 1960s, when India was choosing its national bird, the Great Indian Bustard was a top contender. However, it lost the race to the Indian peacock. Unfortunately, the Great Indian Bustard is on the verge of extinction. In the recent years, a number of Great Indian Bustards have died due to the collision with the high tension power lines running through their habitats. In this regard, the Supreme Court of India is examining if the overhead transmission lines can be replaced by the underground power cables. In this regard, as far as your UPSC prelims is concerned, you should have a basic idea about the Great Indian Bustard. So the Great Indian Bustard is considered to be among the largest flying birds in the world. However, on account of number of reasons, its overall population has declined by almost 75% since 1960s. Some of the reasons for the decline in their population include, first and foremost, loss of their habitat due to the increase in the population, that is the human population, overall development of agriculture as well as infrastructure. Secondly, the Great Indian Bustards, they are normally large in size and usually take low flights, which often results in death due to the collision with the electricity transmission lines. These Great Indian Bustards also face a threat from the stray dogs who often attack the bustard eggs as well as young ones. They also face the problem of poaching, typically outside the protected areas. Initially, the Great Indian Bustard species were widespread across India as well as Pakistan. However, presently their population is estimated to be less than 200 and they are mainly spread across the states such as Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, etc. Some of the places where we can come across a Great Indian Bustard include Kutch in Gujarat, Solapur and Chandrapur in Maharashtra, Kurnool in Andhra Pradesh, Bellary in Karnataka, and in certain pockets of Rajasthan that is primarily concentrated near the Desert National Park. Now, for example, if you have a look at the India's map, particularly the area which is shaded in black color, these areas are considered to be the habitats of the Great Indian Bustard. And as you can see, their habitat is mainly confined to certain pockets of Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and so on. Some of the areas which are considered to be dedicated for the protection of the Great Indian Bustard in India include the Desert National Park located in the state of Rajasthan. It is basically spread across two districts of Jaisalmer and Balmer, and the same question was asked in prelims 2020. Next, we can also come across the Great Indian Bustard in the Nalia Sanctuary in Kutch located in the state of Gujarat, Karera Wildlife Sanctuary in Madhya Pradesh. However, since 1990s, the Great Indian Bustard has disappeared from this particular wildlife sanctuary. Then we can also come across the Great Indian Bustard in the state of Maharashtra, particularly in the Nanaj grasslands located in Solapur. Then in Andhra Pradesh, in a wildlife sanctuary known as the Rolapadu Wildlife Sanctuary. As far as their conservation status is concerned, they are listed under the critically endangered category under the IUCN Red List. They are listed under the Scheduled 1 of the Indian Wildlife Protection Act 1972, which offers them the highest level of protection. They are also listed under the Appendix 1 of the CITES. They are also identified for the Species Recovery Program, which is a component of the integrated development of the wildlife habitat schemes. And more importantly, the Great Indian Bustard has been declared as the state bird of Rajasthan. Recently in Feb 2020, there was a development with respect to the conservation of the Great Indian Bustard. In February 2020, the 13th conference of the Convention on Migratory Species was held in Gandhinagar in Gujarat. During this conference, India had put forward a proposal to include the Great Indian Bustard, Asian elephant, and Bengal florican in the Appendix 1 of the United Nations Convention on the Migratory Species. Now, this particular proposal put forward by India was unanimously accepted by all the member countries. So, the inclusion of the Great Indian Bustard in the Convention on the Migratory Species will in turn lead to the international collaboration for the conservation of the Great Indian Bustard. More importantly, the mascot for the Convention on the Migratory Species COP13, which was held in Gandhinagar in Gujarat, was Gibi, which is the Great Indian Bustard. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article.
This article is from page number 7, The Limits of POSCO. The article is based on single bench judgment of Madras High Court. The judgment came in 2019. In that judgment, the bench quashed a case of kidnap and aggravated penetrative sexual assault. The case was registered under Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act 2012. The bench obviously must have applied its mind before quashing the case. And while doing so, the bench also recommended 2 changes to be brought about as amendment to the POSCO Act. The statement of object and reasons of POSCO Act in the Act itself says that the law was enacted in pursuance to Article 15 of the Constitution, which allows the state to make special provisions for women and children, and also in pursuance to United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The convention is aimed at protecting children from sexual assault, sexual harassment and pornography. India is party to convention since 1992. The act came into force in 2012. There is a need for special legislation because several sexual offences against children, they were not specifically provided for in the laws that existed, or they were not adequately penalized by IPC. So a need was felt that a separate legislation must be there that has a provision for commensurate penalties and the law that can act as an effective deterrent. But as is suggested always, whenever a law is enacted, legislative impact assessment must be done. There is always a chance that unintended consequence can come out of a legislation. In this context, we shall see 2 recommendations given by the single judge bench of the Madras High Court while giving this judgment. One of the suggestion was the age for the definition of child be taken as 16 rather than 18. Section 2D of the POSCO Act defines child, and it defines child as anybody, whether male or female, below the age of 18. So till 18, officially you are teen or you are a child. Furthermore, under the POSCO Act, the consent of a person under the age of 18 is irrelevant, regardless of the nature and circumstances of the sexual interaction or the particulars of the person with whom it has taken place. All sex with a minor is rape. This rigid line of 18 that has been drawn in the law seems problematic to many. First of all, it has been pointed out that the provision denies young people falling in this age bracket of 16 to 18 consensual sexual agency. Several of studies tells us that in this age group of 16 to 18, there is lot of experimental consensual sexual acts. So there must be given an opportunity to young people in this age bracket for consensual sexual agency. But what has been observed is that these young people, they are subjected to control of families, mostly motivated by casteism, communal, orthodox or regressive views. Motivated by these factors, the family members, they lodge false criminal complaints when children are caught in sexual acts. Mostly the parents of girl lodge a complaint that the act was non-consensual. However, consent does not matter. As I have told you earlier, any form of sex with a minor is considered to be rape under POSCO Act. And to maintain rule of law, courts dealing with such cases have very little discretion. Acting as a sexual agency is a matter of right. It is sociological, biological, psychological need of people in this age group. So the single judge bench of Madras High Court was of the opinion that this recommendation will be taken by government agencies seriously so that unwarranted criminalization of consensual or romantic sexual relations can be eliminated. Arguments in this favor also come on the ground that the Juvenile Justice Act of 2015 allows trial of 16 and 17-year-old children as adults when they indulge in heinous offences. And this provision was brought in the Juvenile Justice Act in violation of all international conventions. Trying juveniles as adults in any circumstances has not been provided in any international convention. But we did that. And this legislative decision that we took indicates that we consider young people in the age group of 16 to 18 capable of taking responsibility for their actions. Then why can't they take responsibility when they act as a sexual agency? So similar relaxation must also be given with regard to age of consent. But however, you must know that the age of consent rather was increased from previously provided 16 years to 18 years under the Indian Penal Code. The second recommendation given by the bench of Madras High Court was that in considering the sexual acts, the difference in the age between the offender and the girl involved in consensual sex must be considered. Provisions like this are there in the legal jurisprudence of UK and also US. In US, there is something called as clause in age exemption, also called as Romeo-Juliet laws. This is in recognition of psychological and biological need of people in this age group, their propensity towards sexual adventurism. So cases like these must be dealt separately, and the strict provision of the laws must not apply. This provision will also help young children, both girls and boys, from sexual harassment coming from older people who may use their power position financially or otherwise in society or organization to sexually harass children. But at the same time, I also must tell you, when the matter came to the Parliamentary Committee of Rajya Sabha, while the discussion on POSCO bill, while the discussion was going on when it was still in the form of bill, discussion on POSCO bill in 2011, the Parliamentary Committee of Rajya Sabha believed that a uniform age of 18 will ensure that the trials of child rape would focus on the conduct of accused and the circumstances of the offences instead of putting the victim on trial, as is often the case when consent of the victim is in question. See, the thing is, if you allow consensual sex of young people in the age bracket of 16 to 18, then the cases will mostly be focused on whether it was consensual sex or not. And to determine that, the victim has to be called for questioning. But by making a provision in the law that all sex with minor is rape, the onus falls wholly and squarely on accused. Victims will not be called for questioning. But you obviously understand the consequence of this. You are denying the opportunity to young people of love making. Because if sexual act happens as a consequence of that, it will automatically be called as rape. Perhaps proper legislative impact assessment is required in this regard. You must also remember that Supreme Court via its various judgment has held that a heinous and serious offence is public concern, not a private matter. And while giving the concerned judgment that we are talking about, the Madras High Court single bench squashed the case, saying that this case actually is a private matter. But the cases of aggravated sexual offences, the one in which the harm is caused to the victim bodies or even death, they cannot be concerned as private matter. They are heinous, serious, and they are of public concern. In one of the very important judgment of Supreme Court, Vishakha versus State of Rajasthan, Supreme Court held that the offence relating to modesty of women cannot be treated as trivial. So based on these precedents set by Supreme Court and based on the provision of the POSCO Act, it is extremely difficult for High Court to take a stand balancing the two things. On one hand, the capability of adolescent to consent to sexual interactions, and on the other hand, their vulnerability of being abused and exploited. Because the violence rate against children in India is very high. According to a report by child rights NGO CRY, sexual offence is committed against a child in India every 15 minutes. And there has been an increase of more than 500% over last 10 years. Also, the conviction rate of these crimes are very low, close to 3%. According to the 2016 NCRB report, this is the latest data that we have on crime against children. So indeed, it is a public concern and these cannot be treated as trivial. So what has been suggested by the Madras High Court can be taken seriously to bifurcate the provision of the POSCO law. If you consider these two things, that the right to give consent for any sexual interaction can be given above age of 16 years, and in considering those cases, you must also consider the difference in age between the victim and the accused. And for those cases, you have separate provision in the law, which will be more liberal. That will have a balance between protecting children from sexual offences and giving them the right to act as sexual agency. Now we have come to the end of the session. Answer to yesterday's question of the day and today's question of the day are there on your screen. Please attempt the question, post your answer in the comment section. Also attempt the DNS quiz on the eLearn platform. That's all for today. Goodbye. Take care.